Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hanadi Jordan, Communications Associate at the Bipartisan Policy Center. This week, we're talking about taxes. Do immigrants pay them, and how? After the break, we'll dive into recent news in the immigration world with This Week regular Teresa Cardinal Brown. Get ready to file away your boredom and deduct your stress levels because you're in for a taxing good time. Stay tuned. Hello, Teresa. Welcome back to This Week in Immigration.
Hi, Hanadi. Nice to be here.
It's great to have you back. Last week marked the deadline for Americans to file their taxes for the 2022 year. So if you haven't done so already, it's best to act fast. But it's worth delving into a few commonly misunderstood topics surrounding taxes and immigrants. Do undocumented immigrants pay federal taxes? So that's the first question I want to start off with you, Teresa. Do undocumented immigrants file taxes, and what are the challenges?
Yeah, so it's interesting that we bring this up because that blog that Hunter Hallman, who is a former BPC employee, wrote back in 2018 that's titled How Do Undocumented Immigrants Pay Taxes is one of the top most visited websites on the BPC page. And every year it gets picked up again around tax time and people write articles about it. CNN quoted in an article just this week because it's a perennial question. We know that there are somewhere between 10.5 and 11.5 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. And what we also know is that estimates are from the federal government that about half of them are paying taxes in the United States. And so it's, if they're undocumented and therefore unauthorized to work, how are they paying these taxes? So it's an ongoing question. But before we get to that, I want to talk about just immigrants in general. So about 13.5 to 14% of the entire population of the United States is foreign born. Almost 40% of them are naturalized citizens. So they were immigrants that are now citizens. Around another, quarter are green card holders, and about a quarter of the immigrants are unauthorized. But in total, all immigrants to the United States pay around $330 billion in federal taxes each year. They pay a total of $492 billion if you include state and local taxes. So immigrants actually pay taxes at a higher rate than their percentage of the entire population because total tax revenue for the United States is about $1.6 trillion. So that's something to talk about. In part, that's because we know, and Ben Gittes, who was on this podcast before, that immigrants participate in the workforce at higher rates than native-born Americans. So that's one of the reasons why they're responsible for more taxes. But let's talk first just specifically about the undocumented. As I mentioned, the estimates are that about half of the undocumented population are paying taxes. They pay about $9 billion in withheld payroll taxes. So those of us who are employed by somebody else know that every paycheck that we get, a portion of that paycheck has taxes taken out, both federal taxes and state and sometimes local taxes, depending on where you live. So those so-called payroll taxes are what are taken in by the government every time we get paid. And then when we file our tax return, what we're saying is, this is how much you already took, government. This is how much I owe based on my total income for the year. And any difference there, I either owe the government or they owe me back, and that's my refund. So $9 billion of withheld payroll taxes means a lot of undocumented immigrants are having taxes withheld from a payroll by an employer, which means they are working, quote unquote, on the books, even though they don't have authorization to do so. And there's a number of ways that this can happen. It might be that their employer just did not check their employment authorization before hiring them. It might be that they're working on a fraudulent Social Security number or somebody else's Social Security number. And that's how a lot of undocumented immigrants might be able to work, so to quote unquote, on the books. We know that an awful lot of other undocumented immigrants are working on so-called under the table. They may be receiving cash payments or working in the gig economy. A number of undocumented immigrants may be self-employed. There's no law against being self-employed if you are undocumented because there's no employer to check your employment authorization. So you can start your own business. And so they may be paying business taxes that way. How we know this is that Even people who don't have a Social Security number or are working under a false Social Security number file tax returns every year with the IRS under something called an individual tax ID numbers, an ITIN. And these numbers were created by the IRS in 1996 to allow people who weren't eligible or didn't have a US Social Security number, but had a reason to file tax returns to do so. Initially, the idea was this would be for people who had temporary work visas, maybe that didn't get them a Social Security number, people who just had US based bank accounts that earned interest but weren't US residents, so couldn't get a Social Security number. Those are some of the reasons why ITNs were issued. But IRS doesn't actually ask why you need it. It just says, do you need one? And we'll issue one. And with that ITIN, you can file a tax return. And so even people who are working under the table or under false Social Security numbers will file their tax returns with this ITIN for a number of different reasons. One, the law actually requires that if you make money in the United States, you file a tax return. No matter how you make that money and whether or not you're legally entitled to be working, you're still required to pay taxes. That's the law. And so this is a matter of compliance. And that is the primary reason why IRS allows this, is that their job is to get people to pay their taxes. And that's their number one and pretty much major job. So undocumented immigrants will file their tax returns, will pay extra taxes that they may owe along with those tax returns. It also allows them to claim some tax credits that they may not be eligible for, but say they have US citizen children, their children are eligible for. So the child tax credit, which people who have minor children that are dependent on them can receive, is also available to people who file with an ITIN if their children are US citizens and have Social Security numbers. So those tax credits are available to undocumented immigrants. And so that's how undocumented immigrants pay taxes. They also pay local sales taxes and property taxes for everything they buy and any property they may own. Even if they rent property, part of that rent goes to property taxes. So they pay another 11.6 billion in state and local taxes annually. So the idea that immigrants in general or that undocumented immigrants are not paying taxes is not actually true.
Well, as you said, 50% of undocumented immigrants are paying taxes. And you mentioned part of that is some of them aren't working under the table. This is part of payroll taxes. But you've also described that there's some motivation to file taxes, even when not working over the table, because you can claim certain tax credits like the child tax credit if these undocumented immigrants have children who are American. But outside of those two reasons that you mentioned, why would an undocumented worker pay taxes?
So, another reason is that they want to show that they're trying to comply with the law. Even though they don't have an immigration status, many or most of them hope to someday get a legal immigration status. And one of the things they're trying to show is that they're trying to abide by the laws. So, other than their immigration status, they're paying taxes, they're trying to be a quote unquote good citizen. And they hope that someday, if the law would allow them to legalize their status, this can help sort of show that they have been a good citizen. There's something that is required for naturalization called good moral character, which is a term in the immigration law that basically says, you are trying and you have been not just a good citizen, but you haven't done anything that would demonstrate bad moral character. And some of the things that might demonstrate bad moral character are, fraudulent activities. And so by paying their taxes, they're trying to say, see, I'm really of good moral character. I'm not committing fraud on the government. I'm still paying my taxes, even though I'm working without authorization. So I think it's a hopeful thing. It's their attempt to show the country that they want to be part of the country.
Teresa, there's a lot of misconceptions about undocumented immigrants and their tax contributions. But in your view, what would you say are some of the most common and biggest misconceptions surrounding this topic?
So I think one of the biggest misconceptions we've already debunked is that undocumented immigrants aren't paying any taxes at all. And what we know is that they are paying all kinds of taxes. They may not be paying all of the taxes, and not all of the undocumented immigrants are paying taxes, as we said. but a lot of them are, and a lot of them really want to. And so I think that's something to kind of bear in mind, that when it comes to contributions to the federal coffers, it's there. I think another thing that's probably not well understood is this drive that they have to be part of America, right? They're not trying to stay apart. That they want to become regularized. And I think the last piece of it is that there was a conception that a lot of immigrants are taking benefits from the United States. First of all, let's make it very clear: undocumented immigrants are not eligible for almost all federal welfare benefits. They're not eligible for food stamps. They're not eligible for welfare benefits. They're not eligible for Medicaid, except in very emergency circumstances if they have to go to the emergency room. But many of them are in these so-called mixed status families where they have US citizen children who are born here, or they may be married to somebody with a green card. So those people in their families are eligible for benefits, but the undocumented immigrant themselves are not. But one of the offsets for any of the benefits they might receive is that they are paying into the system. They are paying into taxes. As a matter of fact, when it comes to Social Security and Medicare taxes, which are also payroll taxes, not just income taxes, they are paying into systems that they don't have any anticipation they will ever be able to benefit from, unless they get a legal status sometime in the future. And then it's not clear whether past work would enable them to get benefits from all the payroll taxes they've paid. So, that's a benefit they're paying in that they're not likely to receive. So I think all of those are important to understand when we talk about undocumented immigrants and work and taxes in the United States. The fact that they don't have legal immigration status is, important to understand, but it's also important to understand that in most other ways, many, if not most, undocumented immigrants are trying their best to be law abiding in the United States.
Are these undocumented immigrants risking any exposure to DHS or ICE by filing their taxes through the IRS?
So this is a very interesting question, because I think it's been an ongoing set of conversations between Department of Homeland Security, the Social Security Administration, and the IRS over many, many years. So the Internal Revenue Code, which is the statute that IRS administers, as I mentioned, already requires that everyone who makes income in the United States, no matter how that income is made, has to file taxes. I think many of us are familiar with the apocryphal story that Al Capone, the famous gangster, was eventually put in jail because he failed to file taxes. And so it's important to understand that that's the primary mission of the IRS. The Social Security Administration's primary mission is to match taxes paid by workers through payroll taxes to benefits they would ultimately receive in the future. And so sometimes, as happens, if an undocumented immigrant is using a false Social Security number or someone else's Social Security number, the ability of Social Security Administration to make that match is diminished. And so they try very hard to see if they can able to make a match. And of course, Department of Homeland Security, Immigration and Customs Enforcement is to locate undocumented immigrants and remove them unless they have eligibility for some relief. Those are very different mission sets. And over time, there's been different attempts under different administrations of both parties, frankly, to try to figure out if there's a way to share information. But one primary thing to understand is that the Internal Revenue Code has very strict privacy laws. Tax information on individual taxpayers really cannot be shared with other federal agencies except in very limited circumstances to protect the privacy of the taxpayers. And we've seen definitely different court cases on this over time when different people have accessed individual tax returns that they weren't authorized to access, or fights between Congress and getting individual tax returns, for example, for the former president. So the agencies take this very seriously. And there is not a blanket authorization for IRS to share individual taxpayers' information with the Department of Homeland Security, and neither with Social Security Administration to Department of Homeland Security. As I mentioned, different administrations have tried to either make regulations on this or create MOUs to share some of this information. But I think ultimately it probably would require statutory change, and that just hasn't been something that Congress has done. So right now, undocumented immigrants who file their tax returns are not at risk of immigration enforcement for doing that.
Outside of exposing risk to DHS or deportation, are there consequences for these undocumented immigrants when they file taxes or fail to file taxes?
So, obviously, anybody who fails to file taxes is subject to penalties and possibly criminal sanctions, depending on why you failed to file taxes. IRS enforcement of tax codes has waxed and waned again as their resources. This was also a debate between the last administration and this administration and Congress. Last year, the IRS was given a bump of some $80 billion to increase its ability to process tax filings and do tax audits and enforcement. I think the risk to any particular individual is the same risk as anyone else who's filing taxes. If you don't file, if you fail to file accurately, you could be subject to penalties. And again, as I mentioned, the reason why many undocumented immigrants are doing this is they want to do the right thing by the United States and show they have good moral character. And so failing to file a tax return or failing a tax return that's false in some way would be more likely to get them in trouble than filing a tax return that's accurate, even if they don't have authorization to work in the United States.
You touched on this earlier, but can you walk us through any recent policy changes that have been proposed to address the issue of undocumented immigrants and federal taxes?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, under the Trump administration, there were efforts within the administration to, by regulation, create the ability of at least the Social Security Administration and DHS to share information. So when an employer reports payroll taxes on a Social Security number that is either a false Social Security number, it doesn't exist in Social Security system, or the name that's given by the owner of that number by the employer to the Social Security Administration doesn't match Social Security's own records for who owns that number, the employer will get something called a no match letter. And it basically tells the employer, hey, Social Security thinks there's an error here. Maybe you gave us the wrong number. Maybe there's a problem. Can you ask the worker to straighten it out? And there's the enforcement of these no match letters. Again, the point for Social Security of issuing these is to try to accurately match payroll withholdings to somebody's account so that in the future they are accurately credited with the taxes they paid and the work that they've done so they have the accurate benefits in the future. It's not really for, enforcing some law, but there are some penalties that do exist in law for an employer willfully failing to try to fix this. But the employer ultimately doesn't have the responsibility. It's on the worker. So if the worker does not correct it, that isn't necessarily enough for an employer to say, well, I think you're undocumented and I have to fire you. And that's an ongoing kind of debate between Social Security Administration, employers, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, who sees no match letters as a key indicator that somebody might be unauthorized to work. But so far, as I mentioned, in most cases, the Social Security Administration doesn't necessarily share these no match letters with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So they're not going to have firsthand knowledge of that happening. That having been said, if Immigration and Customs Enforcement goes to an employer to audit them for employment authorization compliance, so every employer has to verify that their workforce is authorized to work before they hire somebody, and ICE has the ability to go in and audit employers to see if they've done that for all their workers. If, as part of that audit, they uncover that the employer had received no match letters and didn't do anything with them, that might give ICE reason to inquire further about the status of some of those workers. So it's not directly there, but it's kind of indirectly there. And as I said, it's an area where I think Congress has in the past tried to pass legislation that would authorize this, either for IRS or Social Security, but it has not succeeded in getting enacted. And I think in part, it's due to the fact that, as we've said many, many times, many Republicans and many Democrats and a lot of the American public would have no problem with creating some sort of legalization path for many of these folks who are undocumented. Interestingly, a lot of the proposals for legalization have included this idea of paying back taxes. So if you haven't been filing your taxes, you might have to file the taxes to be eligible for legalization. And again, I think that's another reason why many undocumented immigrants are trying to file their taxes now.
So, Undocumented immigrants and tax contributions, how significant of an issue would you say this is in the US?
So as I said, I think it's part and parcel of a lot of things. It's part of an overall debate in the United States about the economic benefits of immigrants to the United States. And we talked about it a lot here, and the BPC has done a lot of research. Immigrants, by and large, are good for the overall economy of the United States. Taxes are about whether or not they are fiscally good for the United States. And that means, are they contributing more in revenues than they are taking in benefits? And this is a subject of debate over a lot of time. In general, as I mentioned, undocumented immigrants are not getting benefits from mostly the United States. They're not getting federal benefits. Some states have authorized some state benefits, but they are paying in taxes. So they're probably a fiscal boon to the United States. They are paying more in than they're eligible to get back. Immigrants as a whole are also net fiscal contributors to our budget and our finances of the federal government. That may be different at the state level depending on when immigrants arrive. The biggest state costs for immigrants are education and healthcare. And so a lot of it depends on whether somebody arrives after their educational time is over and so they start working right away. And again, whether or not they're how much they're using local healthcare costs. So I think that's why this comes up a lot. But I think it also has to be understood in the context of the overall economic gains. Economic growth happens when we have more people, and immigrants are right now one of the major contributors to more people and more workers in the country. And so we have to look at, their contributions to the country all inclusive.
Thanks so much, Teresa. We're going to take a quick break and then we're going to discuss recent news in the immigration world. Okay, and we're back. As some of our listeners may have seen in the news recently, immigration to the US has been increasing and has now returned to pre pandemic levels. So, Teresa, what policies have contributed to this, and what implications, if any, does this have for immigration policy moving forward?
Sure. So this is about legal immigration to the United States, green cards issued, temporary visas issued. And during the pandemic, there were significant declines in both of those. Partially, it was fewer people wanting to travel to the United States during COVID. There were travel restrictions in place in the United States and many other countries of the world that restricted entry during the early days of the pandemic. The Trump administration restricted a lot of different types of immigration to the United States, frankly, even before the pandemic. The Muslim and other travel bans that he issued depressed immigration to the United States. Our refugee resettlement was declined significantly from around 110,000 to 15,000 in the last year of the Trump administration, and due to the pandemic was even lower. So that meant that new legal immigrants to the United States were at some of the lowest levels we had seen in decades, probably less than half of the usual annual new immigrants that we see coming to the United States. As we have come out of COVID, the agencies that process applications and benefits, State Department visa offices and consulates overseas, as well as USCIS here in the United States, have gotten back to, or tried to get back as much as they could to, the levels of processing they had before the pandemic. And so USCIS especially made a very big effort in the last fiscal year to issue all of the available immigrant visas for the fiscal year. They made some extraordinary efforts trying to do that. It meant that other parts of the system got further backlogged, but they were able to ensure that they issued all of the available green cards for last fiscal year. Consulates around the world have reopened to visa interviews and visa processing. And so we're getting back on a pace to process the number of visas that we had before the pandemic. But in the intervening years, we created a backlog. And so there are a lot of people who have been waiting for several years to try to get their visa to the United States, whether a temporary work visa or are in the queue for a green card, that are still waiting their chance at that interview overseas or to have their case adjudicated here. And so even though the new admissions are back to the levels we saw pre-pandemic, it's worth noting that we still have a lot of people waiting. And because of numerical limitations on green cards and some of the temporary worker visas, and because the agencies are facing this backlog and haven't been able to increase their capacity to process things very well, we're not likely to exceed this level anytime soon. So, I think that's a challenge. We're not going to make up the missing visas that we lost in the 2 years of the pandemic without some extraordinary measures and, frankly, possibly some congressional intervention, such as a law that would allow us to so-called recapture unused visas from prior years. So the COVID wasn't the only year we didn't use all of the visas Congress had made available. Previous years, maybe due to difficulties in adjudication or other reasons, we didn't issue all the visas available each year. If we were to say, yes, we could use those unused visas in future years, we might be able to recoup some of that lost immigration over time. But right now, it's not, unless Congress acts, it's not likely to happen.
And I'm assuming, based on your phrasing, that Congress is currently not acting to use those unused visas.
Yeah, I mean, there have been some bills that were introduced in the last couple years that would recapture some of those visas. We've talked about the Fairness for High Skilled Immigrants Act or the EAGLE Act, which would reclaim visas and use them for a lot of the employment-based backlog and some of the family-based backlogs. There was the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act, which would have recaptured some visas for healthcare professions that were essential during COVID. Neither of those bills made it across the finish line, and neither have yet been reintroduced this year. And in this new Congress, as we know, Congress is very much focused on the border right now and not on some of those bills. So we'll have to see what happens with those.
So lots of attempts, no successes. And as you mentioned, Congress is really focused on the border, which leads right into my next question. A group of House Republicans have rolled out a proposed package of immigration reforms that would make seeking asylum more difficult and make it easier for the US to stop migrants from entering the country. Can you tell us a little bit more about this package and what the key provisions include?
Yeah, so the background here is that when Speaker Kevin McCarthy was trying to get the speakership, he had to negotiate with a lot of the sort of hardline right wing of his party to get their votes to get him elected speaker because the Republican majority is only 4 seats. And so he couldn't lose more than 4 votes or he would not be able to be speaker. So one of their demands was very quick passage on the House floor of a border bill. And the border bill they tried to move was one introduced by Republican Chip Roy of Texas, H.R. 29, which was very short. It was a one-page bill. And it said that unless the Secretary of Homeland Security could detain everyone encountered at the border or send them back to Mexico, he had to deny entry to everybody, which would have cut off almost all access to asylum because we don't have the ability to detain everybody that arrives to the US-Mexico border right now. Congress has never authorized sufficient detention space for everybody who arrives. I think it's worth pointing that out. But Republicans in the own party objected strongly, most vocally, Republican Tony Gonzalez of Texas, who said, I will not vote for this bill. And he had several others on his side. And so that bill could not make it on the floor because it wouldn't have passed. So they retrenched and decided to put that bill and other similar bills into a package that would go through the regular committee process. So it would be able to be amended and marked up before it went to the floor. So this package of bills was introduced in the House Judiciary Committee this week and has been marked up this week. The bill it contains, I would say, almost all of the pieces of the Chip Roy bill in different forms. It doesn't contain the bill in its entirety, but the pieces of that bill are in the bill, along with a lot of other things. The major asylum restrictions are it would put into statute essentially a safe third country requirement. So anyone who passed through another country on their way to the United States and did not first apply for asylum and be denied there would not be eligible to ask for asylum in the United States. They would have to be sent back to their home country or another country that will take them. So this would not require an actual agreement between the United States and another country that it was safe. It simply would put the obligation on the immigrants to apply. This is similar to the regulation that the Biden administration had put forward that we expect will be finalized by May 11th. But the difference in the Biden regulation is it is a rebuttable presumption that the immigrant can overcome to allow them to apply in the United States, and they have the ability to ask for a review of that decision. The bill that the Republicans had introduced would make it a categorical bar to asking for asylum, not even a bar to getting asylum, but a bar from even asking for asylum. It would also significantly expand other grounds in which someone would not be eligible to ask for asylum. A lot of criminal grounds of ineligibility that would include previous immigration crimes, such as illegal entry or reentry, which would be a felony. It would limit any land border claims of asylum to ports of entry. And obviously, they would have to be Mexicans or Canadians, because if they were third country nationals, they would meet the transit ban part of this. Taken together, it would restrict almost anyone from asking for asylum unless they were flying directly from the country they were fleeing into the United States and arriving at a port of entry. And so I think that would eliminate asylum applications from most of the people we're seeing at the US Mexico border right now. There are other provisions in this bill that are not asylum related. The bill also includes a mandatory e-verify. So we just spent the first part of this talking about unauthorized immigrants and documenting their ability to work or not in the United States. E-verify is an electronic verification system that allows employers to check the documents that are being presented to them to show employment eligibility by someone with federal government databases. And the system works pretty well. There are errors on both sides. There are times when someone who is work authorized is deemed in the system not to be work authorized, and times when people who are not work authorized are granted access to say they are work authorized. Those percentages are relatively low, but they're not zero. So there are errors. It's not a perfect system, but it would give employers the ability to know whether, for example, a social security number matched what's in the systems of the federal government before getting a no match letter. So it does have its benefits, but it would require e-verify mandatorily for all employers in the United States. It is not mandatory right now. It is voluntary for most employers, other than federal government contractors, and some states have state-based e-verify requirements for employers in those states. But most employers in the country are not required to use it. Those provisions do have opposition, particularly from employers in the agricultural industry who have been lobbying for years to create a new system of work visas and legalize many of their workforce. And, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which is the, I'd say, broad-based immigration bill for farm and growers, would have included a rollout of e-verify over time for the agriculture industry as their workforce could be legalized. So I believe that we will see opposition to at least those provisions from definitely the agriculture industry and maybe some other employer groups, since it's not combined with any sort of reform of the legal immigration system or other legalization. There's other provisions of the bill I won't get to. The bill has been marked up in the Judiciary Committee. The Republicans had enough votes to put it through pretty much as it was, with some minor changes. There were no Democratic votes in support. But I think we've already heard from Mr. Gonzalez and some of his colleagues that they're not sure this is the bill that will get their vote. There's another bill that's going through the House Homeland Security Committee next week that will focus more on border infrastructure and personnel. So we'll probably see things there like construction of the wall, technology and surveillance, additional Border Patrol agents, and pay and things like that. That would go through the Homeland Security Committee.
So the bill has lots of opposition from employers, the public, even within the Republican Party itself. But what are we hearing from Democrats about the proposal, and what are their key concerns?
So the Democrats are arguing that this would essentially eliminate asylum in the United States. It would close off asylum. They believe that it's not actually going to be workable, that it will not address the key issues that are happening at the US Mexico border. It's not the direction they want to see border security going. And so I don't think Republicans could expect any Democrats to be on board supporting this legislation. It's all but dead as it goes from the House to the Senate. If they are able to pass it on the floor of the House, it is unlikely the Senate would take it up. That having been said, I think we have seen increasing bipartisan conversations in the House and the Senate about what we do need to do at the border. We have last year, Senator Sinema and Senator Cornyn had introduced a border security bill. At the end of last Congress, Senator Sinema and Senator Tillis of North Carolina, Republican of North Carolina, had tried to negotiate a bill that would have border changes in exchange for legalizing DACA recipients that didn't make it across the finish line. Mr. Gonzalez has been talking with Democrats in the House about border bills. He took Senator Sinema on a tour of the border in his district recently. So bipartisan and bicameral conversations about what to do at the border are happening. So I think there's certainly an attempt to try to come to some kind of consensus of legislation that Congress might be able to pass. I don't think these Republican bills are going to be it in their current form, though.
Well, you said no, they're all but dead now. But would a bill such as this have a chance of passing in the future? Is that something that we could expect down the road?
I do believe that Congress will take up border legislation this Congress in a serious way, not in a messaging way, which I think the House bill right now is. It's a bill that does not have a chance of getting enacted into law. I can't see President Biden signing it. I don't think the Democratic Senate will take it up. But I do think that the situation at the border is now growing in concern for both parties. It's certainly growing in concern for the president. And I think leading into the next election, there will be pressure to try to do something. And so we'll have to see whether sort of the pounding of the table about the border that we saw, for example, on display when Secretary Mayorkas has testified before Congress is replaced by coming to the table to negotiate something that has a chance of passage.
Well, you said that you expect a border bill to be taken up this session, and you already mentioned a few issue areas where there is consensus around legalization and border security. But what major political factors can we anticipate impacting the success of this kind of reform passing Congress?
I think the political factors are that the border is a powerful political tool to wield against the other party. So for Democrats, they are saying that Republican insistence on shutting down the border and shutting down asylum shows that they're not paying attention to humanitarian issues and human rights. They have no care for immigrants, and they're just expressing, xenophobic and racist intents. I think for Republicans, the ability to sort of blame Democrats and particularly President Biden for what they are calling open borders is powerful in terms of moving their base and is setting up a clear distinction between what they think is needed, which is harsher penalties, crackdowns in border security to deal with the issues, and they intend to blame the president and use that to run in the 2024 congressional and presidential elections.
Well, you mentioned earlier the potential implications for immigrant communities if this Republican sponsored package passes. We know that this would effectively ban asylum entirely. But how might this impact the U.S. economy? If it would at all. We talked about how immigrants contribute to the economy through their taxes. Would this have any impact on that?
So, a couple things. One, the e-verify provisions, to the extent that it would cause more undocumented workers to not be able to work or not be able to work above board, probably would decrease taxes. Evidence from states that have required e-verify does not show that it automatically results in more US citizen or US worker employment. So it's not necessarily true that if you remove undocumented workers from the workforce, it automatically means that more US workers will be employed. Some of those businesses just go out of business. Others are not, they're able to employ US workers because they're employing some of these immigrant workers. And so it's not a one-to-one correlation in any way, shape, or form. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that many of these ideas that are being put in the border security bill would be quite expensive. I mentioned already one of them is mandatory detention of everyone. And Congress has never provided support for more than about 40,000 beds, detention beds in any given year. And let's recall that last year, Border Patrol encountered immigrants more than 2 million times. So even if any given month there's 60 to 100,000 new immigrants arriving, there's not enough bed space. And detention is quite expensive. It's several $1,000s per day per immigrant to keep them in detention. So it is not inexpensive at all. Now, proponents of this would argue that by using detention, we would deter people from coming, so the numbers would go down. But it's not necessarily clear that's true, maybe in the short run. But again, we've talked a lot here about how immigration at the border right now is different than it was years ago. And detention and deterrence efforts have not had the same impact with this migration as it has in past times. So that one-to-one correlation is not at all clear, or I'd say definitely proven, at least over the long run. Other things that are being proposed would require foreign policy to get Mexico to take back people that they wouldn't, and that may cost us in other ways. We remember that President Trump threatened Mexico with tariffs on their goods if they didn't agree to the migrant protection protocols. If we put tariffs on Mexican goods, Mexico is our number 2 trading partner. That means goods are more expensive in the United States. It's US consumers that end up paying when we put tariffs on foreign goods that are imported to the United States. So, economically, I think you have to look at beyond just the direct costs at the border and see what the other costs to the economy might be. And it's also worth noting that we are still experiencing very extremely low unemployment, more job openings than we have people looking for jobs right now. Even though prime age labor force participation is back to where it was, overall, we still are missing, if you will, workers from pre-pandemic levels. And so absent, changes to our legal immigration system to allow more legal workers in, there's still incentives for people to come to the United States.
While Congress continues to debate immigration reforms, Title 42 is set to expire on May 11th. And Teresa, you have commented before, actually, you have repeatedly warned that the administration and the borders are not prepared for the expiration of Title 42. So, can you tell us a little bit more about the situation and how you expect it to unfold?
Sure. So, in the absence of Congress passing any sort of changes to how we process people at the border, the administration has proposed some things that they hope will allow them to manage it. We know that there are several 100,000 people in Mexico who are waiting their chance to come to the United States and ask for asylum. So after May 11th, Title 42, which would immediately send many, if not most of them, back to Mexico or their home countries, will be taken down. That means they have to be processed under immigration law. That means they can't necessarily be immediately returned to Mexico or to their country, particularly if they are asking for asylum. So, what the administration has done is proposed some tweaks to how those asylum claims are processed for people arriving at the border. Before Title 42 existed, there was something called expedited removal, which said if you arrive between ports of entry or at a port of entry and don't have authorization to be there, you can be deported back to your country without going to immigration court unless you express an intent to apply for asylum. So, what the administration is hoping to do is expedite that portion of determining whether or not somebody who says, I want to ask for asylum, has a viable claim for asylum. So they have proposed this. One of the things they have done is propose this regulation that we expect would be in effect on May 11th that would say if you have transited another country and did not ask for asylum, you have to essentially meet one of these exceptions that shows that you would be, that you're in a very vulnerable circumstance, or there's a reason why you couldn't have applied for asylum to be allowed to apply for asylum in the United States. Otherwise, you would be subject to expedited removal. So that's one of the things they want to use to try to amend this process. The other thing is they are moving to allow asylum officers to conduct so-called credible fear interviews, which are the threshold to say, yes, we think you might have a viable asylum claim in the future. And then you would go to immigration court to do that while those people are in CBP custody. Now, CBP is supposed to not keep people in its custody more than 72 hours. So they're trying to set up a way in which asylum officers would be able to interview people over the phone from these CBP facilities very, very quickly after they arrived, to determine if they meet one of these rebuttable presumptions or can meet that credible fear standard. So they're moving people and reassigning people to be able to search them, to be able to do that at the border. They've reconfigured some Border Patrol facilities to allow for this. They have stood up some of these soft-sided facilities as well. But the reality is, I think that we're likely to see arrivals increase so substantially, at least in the initial weeks and couple of months after May 11th, that it may overwhelm even these new things that the government is trying to do. May and June are usually seasonally the high point for border crossings at the US-Mexico border because the weather is relatively mild. And so you just usually see a seasonal increase at this time of year. And so combine that with, I think, the pent-up demand that we're seeing in Mexico and other countries to come to the United States, I think we're likely to see overcrowding of CBP facilities again, the inability to meet the 72-hour rule. That means people will probably still be released. We don't know yet if Mexico will be willing to take anybody back into its territory who's not Mexican other than under Title 42. They did not previously take deportees back to their territory from other countries before Title 42 went into place. They did accept people under MPP, but this administration is not proposing to restart MPP. So these would be permanent deportees. They would not be temporarily there waiting an outcome in the future. So again, these are big questions operationally, policy-wise, procedurally, that we just don't have answers yet to from the administration on how they're planning on handle that. They may have other things that they are planning that they just haven't made public yet. And, we'll have to see how this comes about. But I fully admit I am not confident that we are going to be ready. And I think it will be a pretty bad and fairly chaotic. It might even be like the kind of chaos we saw back in 2019 when all the families were arriving, at least for a little while, until we see whether any of these new things the administration is trying to do change any of the incentives. There's also court cases in play that might affect this. So, the parole programs that the administration has put in place for Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Haiti are in court right now, being opposed. And so should the court decide that those programs have to come down, that's another group of people that might just try their luck at coming to the border and see what happens. So there's so many moving parts here. It's hard to know how it's all going to come out. But I would say as of right now, I'm not confident that we have it all ready and are able to handle it, at least in the short term.
Teresa, is there anything that the administration could do at this rate to better prepare for that May 11th timeline?
I think the number one thing they need is probably resources. To deal with the expected increase in numbers, they're going to need to surge personnel. They're going to need additional soft-sided facilities. They're going to need capabilities to keep people in a place that is safe and healthy and, not overcrowded and has medical care and other things that we could expect to need for these migrant populations. I think that's in the short term, that's probably the best thing they can probably accomplish, and they may need Congress's help for that. They may need to ask for supplemental appropriations before, next year's budget is passed to try to manage this. And that will be a debate in and amongst itself. As we've already talked about, Republicans are looking at a totally different set of ways to handle this than the administration is. And I think that does not bode well for additional appropriations. But I think in the short run, that's probably the best we can hope for.
Teresa, as always, it was a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And that's it for our show this week. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all of the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Teresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown. For feedback or questions, you can contact us by emailing immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Hanadi Jordan. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Teresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hanadi Jordan, Natalie Butler, and Teresa Cardinal Brown. Our audio editor is Joshua Joe. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.